Hi boys and girls, and welcome back to Storytime with Kurt Thompson and Music History 101. We are up to the Romantic period right now, and well, I don't want you being too romantic here. Well, we're talking about the romantic composers, but it is all very romantic, so and don't fall in love with the story either, but we're going to talk a little bit about Beethoven, and it's time to dim the lights a little bit, kick up your heels, make a little bit of hot cocoa or your favorite tea, and pull the covers over your feet and get all snuggly, and get ready to fall asleep. Here we go. Beethoven. Of all the great composers, Beethoven was probably the one most inclined to brood. Brood means pout or become emotional. He had plenty to brood about. It says here Bach had an enormous brood of children, but that's something else entirely. Okay, that's a footnote from the author. He has an interesting sense of humor. He was moody, bad-tempered, arrogant, and often insulting. But he could also be warm, affectionate, and good-humored. You just had to catch him on the right day. Beethoven also liked bad puns and pranks. He was sometimes a chair puller. Uh-oh. That sounds funny, doesn't it? I'm a trumpet player. I'm getting ready to sit down at the orchestra, and I don't know he's around there, and to turn around and put my music on my stand. I go to sit down, and I crash right on the floor, and there's Beethoven having a big laugh at my expense. Sounds like a real peach of a guy. Ludwig von Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770 in Bonn, in a little house in Bongas. His family soon moved to a bigger house on Rheingasse, not far away. For years, tourists flocked to the Rheingasse house, took snapshots, and told everybody that they'd seen Beethoven's birthplace. They hadn't, because he was actually born in Bongas. Beethoven's grandfather had been Kapellmeister to the Elector of Bonn, and also a prosperous wine merchant. His father was merely a mediocre musician, and I'm sorry to say, a drunk. It says down here, if he couldn't continue the family wine business, the least he could do was support it. That's about his father. Beethoven's father very much wanted the boy to become a musical prodigy, just like Mozart. Little Beethoven started piano lessons when he was very young, in fact so small that he had to stand on the piano bench to reach the keys. His father also told everyone that he was 2 years younger, just to make him seem more talented. Wow. Even Beethoven himself long thought he had been born in 1772, as opposed to 1770. So let's continue on here. Beethoven was a grubby little boy, the type who always forgets to wash behind his ears. He quit school at 11, and by 16 was court organist to the Elector. He was already beginning to compose small pieces and was an absolute whiz at sight reading. His court uniform was a sea green frock coat, green knee breeches with buckles, stockings of white or black silk, shoes with black bow knots. Interesting. In 1792 he moved to Vienna, where, for a short while, he took lessons from Haydn, Albrechtsberger, and Salieri. He was, page turn, too pig-headed, yikes, I don't have a lot of good things to say about Beethoven here. He was too pig-headed to learn much from any of them. Johann Schenk corrected Beethoven's exercises before he submitted them to Haydn, which saved him some embarrassment. Beethoven was quite a hit in the Viennese society as a concert pianist, even though he didn't have the proper sort of manner. The aristocracy expected him to be subservient and to know his place. Beethoven knew his place, it just wasn't the same place they expected of him. He once told off his patron, Prince Lichnowsky, with the remark, "There are and there will be thousands of princes, there is only one Beethoven." Whoa. He could be very stubborn when he wanted to be, which was most of the time. This Beethoven's a character. If he didn't feel like it, he wouldn't play when you asked him, even if, like the Countess Thun, you got down on your knees and begged him. Whoa. But then Frau van Bernard reminds us Countess Thun was a very eccentric woman. He was too busy thinking about sublime music to worry himself about social niceties. Once, when the violinist Ignaz Schuppanzig complained about a particularly difficult passage in one of Beethoven's string quartets, the composer shouted at him and said, "I can't think about your miserable violin when I'm speaking to my God." He had a raucous laugh and was inclined to spit whenever he felt the urge. Is this Beethoven? Man, he sounded like a complete pig. I can't imagine a guy just spitting whenever he felt like it. Inside? As you might expect with such a hot temper, Beethoven had real trouble keeping servants. They just wouldn't put up with him. In 1820, for example, the kitchen maid he hired on April 17th, he fired on May 16th. The maid he hired on July 1st ran away on the 28th of July. He was a slob, basically. The Baron de Tremont swears that on one visit there was a full chamber pot under Beethoven's piano. When Beethoven came visiting, it was a good idea to hide away from the fine porcelain. He dropped things. And Beethoven usually cut himself shaving. Now let's go back to, what's the chamber pot? Where was that? Okay, you know what a chamber pot is. They didn't have, toilets and running water a lot of times in these apartments, of course, back then. So they had a big pot to pee in, or you do your other business. And so, I guess I guess what they're trying to imply here is that Beethoven would do his business and not take it outside and dump it. So when you came in, I guess you were going to get a good nose full of it. Beethoven was no better in restaurants. He would leave without paying the bill, or sometimes absent-mindedly pay for a meal he hadn't ordered. He scribbled music on napkins, tablecloths, and menus. He once got so angry at a waiter that he dumped his plate of veal and gravy over the man's head. Sounded like he was a real nut. He was fond of fish, but his favorite dishes were scrambled eggs in a bread soup or a heaping bowl of macaroni and Parmesan cheese. He liked his coffee strong, always 60 beans to the cup. But we mustn't lose sight of what makes Beethoven important. He may have been a boor and a slob, but he was a great composer. The issue of greatness is sometimes problematic. Alfred Einstein, in his book Greatness in Music, gets at the heart of the matter when he asks, was Frederick the Great great? Well, was he? Okay, so we digressed a little bit there. Back to Beethoven now. He wrote 9 symphonies, 5 piano concertos, 16 string quartets, 10 sonatas for violin and 5 for cello, 30 piano sonatas, 2 masses, more chamber music than I can name, and a duet for obbligato eyeglasses. He wrote 1 opera, Fidelio, and 4 overtures that started off. The first 3 were trial runs and are now called the Leonore overtures, just to avoid confusion. We know he was a great composer because his brain was so big, and, as Wagner pointed out, because it was encased in such a thick skull. As the autopsy reported so eloquently, his brain contained a smaller proportion of water than is normal. The convolutions seemed to be of double depth and more numerous than ordinarily. Something must have been going on in there, according to the coroner, or whoever did the autopsy there of Beethoven. Beethoven never married, although he liked to flirt, and his friend Wegler tells us that he was always in love with someone. He once boasted that, of all these infatuations, the longest lasted only 7 months. Okay, keep going on here. Perhaps, unlike Bach, Grieg, or Stravinsky, he had no eligible cousins to marry. He proposed to Magdalene Wilhelm, a singer in the Vienna court opera, but she refused him because he was so ugly and half-cracked. It's probably just as well. Beethoven had syphilis. Ooh. Whew. Syphilis. Not to mention, Beethoven also had chronic constipation, alternating with diarrhea, typhus, and dropsy. Man, he was completely effed up. Dude had bad health. He was hardly the tall, dark, and handsome type. Well, he was dark anyway. He had good teeth, piercing eyes, and a stern, pockmarked face. Okay, after his brother Caspar died, Beethoven fought a long court battle with his sister-in-law Johanna for custody of her son Karl, Beethoven's nephew. Beethoven might have meant well for the boy, but he certainly had some nasty things to say about Johanna, or is it Johanna, whom he thought an unfit mother. When he was being polite, he called her the Queen of the Night. I won't repeat what else he called her. Queen of the Night as in prostitute. Um, the years of the court battle took their toll on Beethoven. It was all he could do to compose 2 cello concertos, 3 piano sonatas, including the Hammer Clavier Sonata, and the song cycle On die Fern Geliebt. I'm probably butchering that, but again, I'm not German. I haven't studied German, and really don't care. You can probably figure it out. Hardly worth mentioning, really. The biggest tragedy of Beethoven's life, of course, was his increasing deafness. He began to notice it when he was about 30, and before he was 50, he had lost his hearing entirely. As the years wore on, he broke more and more strings on his piano, pounding the keys, trying to hear the sounds. In the end, he fell apart completely and died in 1827. Anselm Hüttenbrenner, who was at his bedside, tells us that in his final moments, Beethoven roused himself from his coma to shake an angry fist at the heavens. There was a dramatic clap of thunder and a flash of lightning, and the great composer was dead. We shouldn't trust Hüttenbrenner's word completely. After all, he was the one who lost the 2 movements of Schubert's unfinished symphony. Interesting. At Beethoven's funeral, a crowd of 20,000 lined the streets to pay their last respects. Schubert and Hummel were among the pallbearers. Interesting. Hummel. How about that? I had no idea. The famous Hummel Trumpet Concerto that Maurice Andre and Winter Marsalis and many others have played, including myself. Not as good as them. How about that? Hummel actually was a pallbearer to Beethoven's funeral. Interesting. Didn't even know that. Music history tends to romanticize Beethoven, seeing him as the almighty genius struggling against tragic deafness. I prefer to think of him in those moments when he took time out from composing glorious music to insult an aristocrat or dump dinner over a waiter's head. Here's something interesting here too. Luigi Leblanc, an operatic bass who sang at the funeral of Beethoven, had also sung at Haydn's funeral. Later, he would sing at Chopin's funeral. He would have towered over Beethoven if Beethoven had been alive, because Luigi was nearly 7 feet tall. Now damn, that's tall. Okay, so that's Beethoven, kids, and we're going to keep marching on here. So when you wake up in the morning, and if you got time to kill, or tomorrow evening, go ahead and turn me back on for more romantic composers. Until that time, this has been Kurt Thompson with Storytime and Music History 101.